Welcome back, students, to part 2 of period 7. So hopefully you have already watched part 1, which was like about 36 minutes, 37 minutes, going from the progressives all the way through to World War I. This section should be a little bit shorter, but still has a lot of very useful information. We're going to be going over the 1920s, the Great Depression in the 1930s, and World War II. So getting right back into this with the 1920s, some of the main ideas that start everything off is when Warren G. Harding, who's going to be elected in the election of 1920, and remember that's a zero involved, and we all know what's probably going to happen to presidents that get elected in zeros. Spoiler alert, yes, he's going to die in office as well. But he states something called trying to get America back into this new normalcy. Trying to bring America back to where it was pre-World War I. And his economic belief was one of laissez-faire. And we've talked about laissez-faire politics in the past, talking about this hands-off ideas, no government regulations, trying to get business to be booming again. And the Roaring Twenties is called the Roaring Twenties for a lot of different reasons, and just for this one example right here, it's because the 1920s is going to be a time of consumption. And we're talking about material consumption. We could even talk about illegal alcohol consumption, since we talked about earlier in the first part of period 7 that the 18th Amendment, this temperance movement, was passed. And a lot of this consumption is going to be done through advertisements, radios, magazines, newspapers, and the people who were sponsoring these advertisements, sports stars, celebrities. In fact, one of the biggest sports stars of this time is Babe Ruth. So if you're seeing all of a sudden Babe Ruth is sponsoring whatever the material is, people are like, you know what, that might be a really, really good idea. Now, the two main industries of this time are going to be houses and cars. People are buying bigger houses. Cars become more affordable, and why they become more affordable is mass production. From before, you know, cars were pretty expensive. Not everyone has them. By the time we get into the middle part of the 1920s, you know, a car now only becomes 2 to 3 times someone's annual salary, in which then installment plans were put into place. Kind of like, you know, like a car payment now these days, so you don't have to put the whole entire amount of the, you know, of the car at one time. So people were doing this with a lot of home appliances as well. You know, people are going to get vacuum cleaners and all sorts of stuff to put into their homes. And when all of these installment plans kind of, you know, all come together, it makes for one very, very large monthly bill. And when, you know, eventually things start to go down, there's going to be some issues. So when we think of the 1920s, usually we think of women's rights and flappers. Okay, this new flapping movement, sure. Okay, the bobbed haircuts, the women who were wearing the short dresses, you know, the short swimsuits, smoking and drinking, being more promiscuous. It was a more independent type of woman, and this is kind of, you know, moving away from what this old Victorian norm was. It was these group of women that are just kind of going against the social norms of what their parents would have expected. And you're going to see this, you know, throughout, you know, history, that usually the younger generation will rebel against, you know, their parents and what their parents are pretty much, you know, kind of saying. So cities are growing. More people are going into these urban cities. There's a lot more factories. There's a lot more work. Women now are getting jobs. They're called pink-collar jobs. We're talking about nurses, teachers, secretaries. And a lot of these things about with the secretaries is that, you know, these business people would ask, how long do you think, are you married? Are you not married? These questions are legal back then. And the reason why they're looking for it is because they figured that it was a social norm for a woman to eventually get married, and when they get married, they're not going to work anymore. This idea of cult of domesticity. So a lot of times these business owners would start asking, well, what is your agenda with getting married? Are you going to get married? Is this something that's going to happen? Because then I got to realize, or I have to start planning, when am I going to have to rehire? And that's kind of what a lot of these social ideas were going. Now, like I had already told you, Warren G. Harding is elected, and he's president from 1921 to 1923. And when he is elected, like I said, this back to normalcy, this laissez-faire. Thing is, his whole entire administration for 3 years is met with scandals. And the biggest one is the Teapot Dome scandal, in which that a lot of his cabinet members are going to be involved with. But by 1923... Warren G. Harding dies, and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, is going to take over. And Calvin Coolidge's nickname is Silent Cal. The guy does not really talk. And he's also a laissez-faire believer in this idea of economics. And Calvin Coolidge, his main phrase that he's really known for is, "The business of America is business." So he is really bringing in, once again, these laissez-faire economics, no government regulation. So all of these businesses are booming. The stock market is booming. Things are going really well. Now, if we're talking about art and literature of the 1920s, the Great Migration is going to be happening, in which African Americans are moving from the South up into the North to try to escape racism, only to find out that racism is still going to be around in the North even at this time. But this does lead into something called the Harlem Renaissance, in which you're going to start to have jazz music, which is going to be more mainstream. A lot of your poets, singers, artists, and this African-American culture, the Harlem Renaissance, like I said, becomes a mainstream thing. The other group of writers is called the Lost Generation, like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. And their main things is that they're disillusioned with the ideas of society. They kind of said that, this materialism that is happening during the 1920s isn't right, and it's, uncalled for, and they're trying to kind of write about how society has lost touch with a lot of different things. And speaking of losing touch, intolerance is still a big idea of the 1920s. Your KKK has risen again, and now that you're seeing that there's more racism in the North, or just as much racism as there was before, it's not like anything changed, it was just this idea that racism is going to be around. There's race riots throughout all of the cities through the United States, a lot of race riots, and one of your biggest ones actually in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in which this was called Black Wall Street, and a lot of African-American business people were down there making a lot of money, and there's going to be a race riot down there as well. Other things of intolerance is with immigration. The United States has this Red Scare, and they are starting to become a little bit more intolerant and fearful that some of these immigrants coming in are going to be communists. So they start passing quota acts. There's the Immigration Quota Act. One of them goes from 3% based on the 1890 census that are allowed to come in, and then they revise it to only 2%. So you're seeing a theme that immigration and trying to limit the amount of foreigners coming into the United States was something that they were kind of trying to do. And then you have the Sacco Vanzetti trial, in which it was two Italian immigrants that were well-known anarchists that are going to be accused and convicted of robbing a bank and murder, only to come out later down the road after they're already executed that they were actually innocent. And people were looking at Sacco Vanzetti as, well, they're Italian, they're immigrants, there must be communists and anarchists, let's go and get rid of them. Another thing of intolerance was the idea and the separation of science and religion. The Scopes trial, this trial that was based off of whether or not the Butler Act was right or not. And this Butler Act was talking about in these Tennessee schools whether or not evolution could be taught. If you have to remember that Tennessee's in something called the Bible Belt at this time, so there's going to be more religious viewpoints between, science and religion. And Scopes is still, the teacher, is still found guilty of teaching evolution in school. Later, he doesn't have to pay the fine because of a technicality, but it's going to be more of a moral victory for science that people were saying, look at this, in seeing the viewpoints of all these people in Dayton, Tennessee. Just to give you kind of a heads up on that one, the defense attorney is the very famous trial lawyer Clarence Darrow, and the prosecutor was none other than William Jennings Bryan. This guy just does not disappear. He just always keeps on going. Now, the last part of this 1920s, before we get into the economics that's going to lead into the Great Depression, is Prohibition. Now, Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, like we already said, is going to ban the sale, the consumption, the production, and even the transportation of alcohol. While this happens, it gives a negative effect for everything. There's going to be more people drinking than ever before. Murders go up, crime goes up, deaths are going up because people are making bathtub gin and they're drinking, like rubbing alcohol because they read alcohol. I mean, all sorts of crazy stuff. The mob gets involved. Al Capone becomes a, major crime, organized crime individual during this Prohibition. And Prohibition with the federal government, it was being overseen by the IRS. Yes, the ones that collect taxes. And it was impossible for the IRS to actually try and stop everybody that's in violation of this Volstead Act. And the Volstead Act was the law that kind of gave this 18th Amendment power. And Al Capone actually gets arrested on tax evasion, not even on violation of the Volstead Act. And some of these IRS agents, they're going to be called the Untouchables, specifically in Chicago. They made a movie about it, Kevin Costner, Sean Connery, in the 1980s. These Untouchables, they were the ones that were trying to stop Al Capone and these other, violators of the Volstead Act. So that kind of goes through this first part of these roaring 20s, and then our second part is going to be the economic aspects of the late 1920s going into the 1930s. So like I said, the second part is going to be about leading into this economic crisis, starting in the late 20s and going through pretty much dominating the entire 1930s. And what's really happening is that there's overproduction of goods in the 1920s, these mass-produced goods. And the problem is that there's not enough people that are buying these goods. So they're just kind of laying on the shelves and whatnot, and not enough people are buying it. There's other reasons for this as well. This new idea of credit, that people were overextending their monthly incomes and budgets because they're buying so much stuff on credit, and everyone starts kind of getting into credit trouble, not credit card trouble like nowadays, because there's no such thing as credit cards back in the 1920s, but very, very similar ideas. There's also debt issues that are going on with the United States and the rest of Europe because of war. The war debt, a lot of it coming from the Treaty of Versailles, and these European powers are unable to pay the debts that we had loaned out to them as well. There's also going to start to be inflated stock markets. And eventually this stock market is going to collapse. And a lot of reasons why that the stock market is going to collapse is because people were buying things on margin. And what that meant was that they were putting up 10% of, of the stock market price at that time, and they would pay, the rest of it later. The problem with doing that is that if the stock market continues to go up, then everything is going to be okay. But when things start to go down, and they were supposed to pay that price earlier, they're never able to pay that price. So that's why this buying, the stock on margin, it actually starts hurting, the whole entire, stock market at this point. So in October 29th, 1929, we call this Black Tuesday. So this is actually the second part of the stock market crash. The first initial crash was on that Thursday. If we're going to go back, was that, the 28th, 27, 26, 25, October 24th, that's Black Thursday. And then Black Tuesday would be the final one. Now, no one, and there's always this myth about people that were killing themselves on Black Thursday. No one ended up killing themselves or anything like that on the first day. It would be after Black Tuesdays, where you start seeing these business people and these rich people that started to, create this mass, suicides and everything that's going on. And the president of the United States at this time is Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was, the Secretary of Commerce during Calvin Coolidge's administration, and he was part of the Food Administration during, World War I. So he is a businessman that understands the idea of the business cycle. His problem was that he believed in something called rugged individualism. And this idea of rugged individualism is that he said, you know what, United States of America, the only way we can get out of this problem is if you are able to get out of this problem. So he was pretty much saying, get out of it yourselves without government intervention. Then he changes his mind towards the end of his term, but it's almost too little too late. And this is where he comes up with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and he starts coming up with other things. But like I said, it's just too little too late. And another thing that really hurts Herbert Hoover is this idea of the bonus army, in which these World War I veterans that were promised bonuses and pensions, Herbert Hoover refuses to honor these, and he calls them communists, and he calls them the military to break up the whole entire thing. In fact, the guy that he brings in to break up this bonus army march is Douglas MacArthur, who's going to be very, very popular when we get into World War II and with the Korean War. So there's going to be a new person, a more motivated, motivational speaker type of politician named Franklin D. Roosevelt from New York, who's going to really promote that the government needs to help the people. And the people, by the time that Herbert Hoover's kind of done by 1932, like, you know what? We just need something completely different because this isn't working. Yes, the government right now needs to help, the American people. And FDR also was promoting the idea of trying to end prohibition, which he does when he is elected by 1933, and that's going to be the 21st Amendment, in which then he does, end prohibition. And a nice kind of way to remember it is 18th and 21. So 18 and 21. 18 years old, you cannot, drink. So the 18th Amendment, 18, you cannot drink. The 21st Amendment, you're 21 years old, you can drink. So it's a nice, easy way to try to remember the differences between the 18th and the 21st Amendment. So FDR is going to win with 57% of the popular vote, and he's going to pretty much sweep most of the states. And when he first gets in there, it's his 100 days in which he's got control, and they just start passing law after law after law. Now, one of the main groups that's having a huge issue is the farmers. Okay, the farmers, they were producing way too much, and because they were producing way too much, they were actually environmentally hurting the soil. So this was called the Dust Bowl, in which there was swirls of dust that was going across the United States, that was, covering up most of, the old farmland. There's going to be these dust storms that are going to be happening. So Franklin Roosevelt will eventually give aid to farmers, and he will tell farmers, stop growing food. If you stop growing food, you're going to raise the prices of your crops, so then you will be able to actually afford things again. Other, programs that FDR does is the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, and that was just helping with banks, and it creates something called the FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, in which banks were then going to be insured, or at least people's accounts were going to be insured, so that they didn't have an issue where all of a sudden, the banks didn't have any money to give out to the people. There's always that famous scene in that Jimmy Stewart movie called It's a Wonderful Life, where all of a sudden he's married, and then the stock market crashes, they close the bank doors, and he goes in there and he starts giving out his honeymoon money to the people, so then they will at least have some money, since they had no money in the actual bank vaults at the time. Another one's the National Industry Recovery Act of 1933, which was just trying to talk about workers' rights. And then you have your Agricultural Adjustment Act with these farmers that were trying to be told to stop growing so much food, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was building dams in the area, creating construction. So you just have a lot of different acts that are getting involved. And this idea of the government getting involved is called Keynesian economics. It was the idea that the government needed to spend money in order to stimulate the economy. Because if the government spends money on individuals creating a job, that person now has a job who then will buy goods and services that they need, in which then will stimulate other industries. So that is Keynesian economics, and that's really what FDR was trying to accomplish. And like I said, he does other programs. Usually, when we're talking about these programs, just completely understand that he's trying to create jobs, mostly construction jobs and public works jobs, like building schools and playgrounds, and the government is going to be spending, some money to get involved with this. Now, don't think that every single person is going to be a fan of FDR. You're going to have critics. You're going to have people that think, like Charles Coughlin, who's pretty much saying that FDR is a communist. And Coughlin was a radio, host. He would have a radio show and everything, and he had a bunch of listeners. He started to, by the very, very end, have a lot of fascist overtones, in which case he was also considered to be anti-Semitic. 1930s, the rise of fascism in Europe, a lot of people were, leaning towards this kind of, ideal system. Then you have Townsend. Townsend was suggesting that there should be some sort of aid for elderly people, who can't work, which is where the basis of the Social Security Act is going to be coming in. And then you also had Huey Long, who said that Roosevelt didn't go far enough. Huey Long was very big in Louisiana. He's called the Kingfish. He's going to make a run for president, but he's assassinated before he kind of even makes it, any far into it. But his idea was something called the Share Our Wealth Program. And the idea behind the Share Our Wealth Program was that he said that we needed to tax rich people in order to redistribute the wealth into the common people. So where, people were now saying that FDR is going too far to the left, people are also saying that FDR isn't doing enough. FDR really can't win and can't really please everybody. Other things that FDR is kind of known for during this time is court packing. And when we're talking about court packing, we're talking about how Franklin Roosevelt really tries to bring in more judges that would pass more New Deal legislation, or allow him to have this New Deal legislation that won't be found unconstitutional. So his idea was have an age limit, that if you're 70 and a half years old, you should be retiring, and that would have removed like 6 different judges, so then he could have nominated more. Another idea was maybe move the amount of judges from 9 to 15, once again making another 6 judges. So overall, Franklin Roosevelt was trying to bring in a new court system, or at least a new group of judges, in order to keep his legislation for being constitutional. And by the time we're really all said and done with this, we're going to have another political realignment in which you're going to have Republicans that are going to be wanting small government, laissez-faire type of government, where then you're going to have more of your New Deal Democrats. Like Lyndon Johnson will technically become a New Deal Democrat because of his Great Society program when we get into period 8. So FDR does leave a lasting legacy with this Great Depression. Now the problem is with this Great Depression is that Franklin Roosevelt, by 1937, things are doing really well, but then he just takes things into, he doesn't continue the spending like he was supposed to be doing at that time, and more unemployment falls. Okay, so what I usually teach my students is that the Great Depression isn't solved with any of the New Deal programs. It's going to be World War II that's really going to get the United States out of this Great Depression and back into, a strong economic, healthy situation. What's happening in the rest of the world during this 1930s is that, while the United States is trying to solve their own problems and they're being isolated, you're having a rise of fascism going on in Europe through, Germany and Italy, in which Hitler is taking over different places. There's appeasement involved, all bunch of AP European things that, if you want to go and learn a little bit more, there will be videos for that for you to watch. And in Japan, you're talking about a rise of a new empire in which they start island hopping as themselves, that they're trying to go from place to place in order to get more, resources as time's going on. And the thing is that the United States is trying to remain neutral, but once again, they see themselves more closely allied with the British, in which they allow cash and carry and lend-lease, so England can start preparing themselves for war, which pretty much means that the United States was kind of renting out their equipment in order for the British to be, fighting in this time. FDR starts preparing. He creates a Selective Service Act in which people 21 to 35 are going to register for a draft in case there ever was military fighting. And the thing is, the United States domestically, you have a lot of people that either want to be isolated, some people definitely want to fight the Nazis, but then you also have an America First movement. And this America First movement was talking about how the United States needs to worry about America first and not everybody else, and not about the rest of the world, and only about Americans, and it had a lot of fascist overtones to it. In fact, one of the main spokespeople for the America First movement was Charles Lindbergh. Okay, so you're going to see that not every single person in the United States is going to be for, what's going on. In fact, FDR, if we're going to be talking, straight up with this, FDR wasn't exactly a friend to the Jewish population. In fact, there's going to be a situation called the St. Louis, which docks in Cuba, and when it's in Cuba, the Cuban government will not let these Jews, board or get off of the ship and disembark. So they go to, the United States, and FDR says no and sends them back to Europe, in which, most of these Jews are going to be killed. Now, the thing is, FDR also is not aware of the Holocaust at this time. He has no idea what's really going on over there. He doesn't exactly know about concentration camps. So you can definitely say that the Americans were not going to try to make this about Jews or discrimination whatsoever, because he does not think that they're really going to get enough people that would be willing to fight, in this case, for Jewish rights. And like we said earlier, with the Holocaust, FDR is not going to be aware about the Holocaust until very, very late in the war. And his theory was, if you win the war, you will end the Holocaust, instead of trying to find each and every single concentration and labor camp that was there. Well, the United States is going to get involved on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, which is where the Pacific base was, and the next day the United States, they declare war on the Empire of Japan. So domestically, what's going on is men are joining and being drafted into the military, and they're going away, which is now leaving these jobs open for women and definitely a lot of different minorities. And with women, there's going to be a new thing called Rosie the Riveter. Let's go, and you go and work in these factories and, try to fill the spots that these men, have left vacant. At the same time, you're starting to have, not so much anxiety, but people that were starting to be against Japanese Americans that were living on the West Coast, in which the United States and FDR passes the Executive Order 9066, in which gives the military the right to put people who are going to be, or who they had thought was going to be considered spies, into internment camps, which ends up being a lot of Japanese Americans that are living on the West Coast. And there's going to be a Supreme Court case, I'm probably going to slaughter the name, but Korematsu versus the United States, in which says that, yes, the United States can put people into internment camps. Other groups during World War II that kind of had some improvements, let's put it this way, Mexican Americans, and there's going to be something called the Bracero program. The Bracero program was contracting workers from Mexico to come into the United States to, to work. Now, don't think that everything is good for Mexican Americans. There's going to be something called the Zoot Suit Riot, not just a song made popular by a swing band in the 1990s. The Zoot Suit Riot was actually a kind of race riot in which people were going after Mexican Americans in Los Angeles in 1943. African Americans did see some improvements. You have a civil rights leader, A. Philip Randolph, in which is trying to help this, try to ban discriminatory in workplaces. And a lot of African Americans start doing this double V campaign, a victory in Europe against fascism and a victory here in the United States for civil rights and equality. So there are going to be some domestic improvements. And like I have done with other wars, it's not so much about the battles. Yeah, we can talk about D-Day and how the Pacific is going and everything like that. But that's not really, where the AP College Board test usually goes. I'm probably going to be there's going to be more videos probably where I will focus on battles in case for, people just want to learn a little bit more. But just for at least APUSH, we're only going to be worrying about, the foreign policy ideas and the domestic things. And speaking of foreign policy, there's going to be a bunch of different conferences that are going to be going on. You have the Washington Conference, the Casablanca Conference, Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam. All of them are either trying to figure out the war effort, and that's with the big three, which is going to be Churchill, FDR, Stalin, the United States, England, and the Soviet Union. And specifically, though, by the time as some of these conferences are going on towards the later part, a lot of the questions in these conferences are going to be, how should the world look after this war? How should we rebuild Germany so this doesn't happen again? What should, the world do to prevent another world war like this? And by the very, very end, Churchill has been voted out, and there's Clement Attlee in there, and FDR dies in 1945. You remember, he gets elected in 1940, so there's another zero right there that he has his brain aneurysm, and that he dies. So Harry Truman ends up taking over as president of the United States. And Harry Truman is a different type of Democrat, where FDR and Stalin were very, very close and friendly with each other. Harry Truman doesn't trust the Soviets whatsoever and really doesn't trust anyone. And when Harry Truman does take over in April of 1945, when FDR dies, he has no idea about the Holocaust. He has no idea about this thing called the Manhattan Project, where they're going to be creating the atomic bombs. He has no idea how the war effort's really going, even in Japan. So this is where this atomic bomb discussion is coming into play, where Harry Truman is afraid that if this war keeps on going, he's going to have to invade Japan. It's probably going to cost 1 million to 2 million American lives, plus the Soviet Union is going to get involved, and he already doesn't like communism. So Harry Truman says, you know what, let's drop some bombs. And that's really his logic for this. So he drops 2 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan officially surrenders. So this is where period 7 kind of ends. And when we pick up again with period 8, we'll go into this causes of this Cold War, which is really going to dominate most of the talks, or at least most of the topics, I should say, through period 8. So thank you very much for watching period 7 part 2. Okay, so please subscribe. Please watch my other videos for your review coming up for any of your tests and everything like that. So thank you very much. Keep on studying, and let's go get a 5 on that exam.